My name is Jacob Thorpe, 41 years old, a former police officer retired on disability after an incident I'd rather not recall. I spent my life unraveling mysteries, chasing criminals, and exposing frauds. I never believed in fairy tales or ghost stories. To me, true terror always stemmed from the actions of men, not from imaginary creatures haunting children's dreams. It was this unwavering conviction that led me to accept the invitation from Ellen Blackwood, a local journalist obsessed with urban legends. She was investigating a story about the Holloway House, a Victorian mansion abandoned on the outskirts of town. Apparently, there were rumors of a supernatural entity inhabiting the place, the Shadow Fairy, they called her. "Jacob," Ellen said, her eyes sparkling with a mix of fear and excitement, "I need you to come with me. Your experience as a police officer would be invaluable." I laughed, brushing off her concern with a wave of my hand. "Ellen, you know I don't believe in this nonsense, right? It's probably just some vandal having fun at the expense of the local superstitions." She bit her lip, hesitant. "Maybe. But what if it's not? There have been disappearances related to that house, Jacob. People who went in and were never seen again." That piqued my interest. Disappearances were something real, something I could investigate. "All right," I finally agreed. "Let's take a look at your haunted house." Little did I know that this decision would change my life forever, dragging me into a nightmare from which I would never fully awaken. Holloway House loomed against the night sky, a grotesque and imposing silhouette that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Its towers jutted at impossible angles, and the broken windows resembled empty eyes watching our approach. Ellen shivered beside me. "We can still turn back," she murmured, but I could feel her curiosity overshadowing her fear. "Don't be ridiculous," I replied, my voice steadier than I truly felt. "It's just an old house. Let's go in and get this over with." The iron gate creaked in protest as I pushed it open, a sharp sound that reverberated through the abandoned property. The garden, once likely majestic, was now nothing more than a tangle of weeds and dead trees. As we walked along the path of broken stones toward the main entrance, I couldn't help but notice the oppressive silence that enveloped us. No bird song, no buzzing of insects. It was a silence so thick it felt like it had substance. The front door stood ajar, inviting us in. I hesitated for a moment, a feeling of dread settling in my stomach. But I was Jacob Thorpe, the skeptic, the former cop who didn't believe in fairy tales. With a determined sigh, I pushed the door and stepped inside. The interior of the house was a monument to decay. The smell of mold and decomposition was almost unbearable. Our footsteps echoed in the entry hall, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath our weight. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and dust danced in the light of our flashlights. "Let's split up," I suggested, ignoring Ellen's panicked look. "You check the downstairs. I'll head upstairs to look at the rooms." Ellen nodded reluctantly, and I watched her disappear into the darkness of what seemed to be an old living room. Alone, I began to ascend the staircase, each step protesting under my weight. It was at the top of the stairs that I first felt it, a subtle shift in the air, moving away from the fetid, dusty atmosphere to something more alive. The temperature dropped several degrees, and I could see my breath forming clouds before my face. "Bullshit," I muttered to myself, gripping the flashlight tightly. "It's just a draft." But as I moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, something ancient, patient, and hungry. The master bedroom was a study in contrasts. Once, it must have been magnificent. Remnants of golden wallpaper still stubbornly clung to the walls, and the remains of a canopy bed dominated the center of the room. But now, everything was shrouded in a layer of decay and abandonment. It was then that I saw her. In the darkest corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to accumulate unnaturally, something stirred. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or the lack thereof. But as my eyes adjusted, the figure took shape. It was vaguely feminine, yet in a way that defied logic and sanity. Her body seemed to be made of liquid shadows, constantly in motion. Long, tangled hair trailed on the floor, but it was made of pure darkness, not strands. And her eyes? God, her eyes were wells of infinite blackness, sucking all the light and hope from the world. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that it must be some kind of hallucination. But my body knew the truth. Every nerve, every fiber of my being screamed in primordial panic. I tried to move, to flee, to call out for Ellen. But I was paralyzed, trapped by a terror that surpassed anything I had ever experienced. And then she spoke. "You came for the darkness, Jacob." Her voice was a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It pierced through my skin, my bones, touching something deep and primordial within me. The lights of my flashlight began to flicker frantically, as if trying to escape the horror surrounding us. With each flash the creature, the shadow fairy, was closer. Flash. She was mere meters away. Flash. Now just inches away. Flash. I could feel her icy breath on my face. And then total darkness. I felt her sharp claws piercing my skin, tearing not just flesh and muscle but something deeper. My essence. My soul. I screamed. I screamed with all the air in my lungs, with all the strength I had left. But in that cursed place, no one could hear me. No one but her. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been minutes, hours, or days. In the absolute darkness that enveloped me, time lost all meaning. Gradually, I regained some awareness of my surroundings. I was lying on the dusty floor of the room, my body aching and cold. The flashlight lay broken beside me, useless. With effort, I managed to sit up. My head throbbed, and every movement sent waves of pain through my body. But the worst was the feeling of emptiness. Something fundamental had been ripped from me, leaving a hole that I knew would never be filled. "Ellen?" I called, my voice hoarse and trembling. There was no response. Groping in the darkness, I managed to stand. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape that room, that house. But something was wrong. The hallway seemed longer, more winding than I remembered. The shadows on the walls appeared to move, dancing at the corner of my eye. I descended the stairs, each step an agony. The entry hall was empty, with no sign of Ellen. The front door was shut, no, more than that. It seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving only a smooth wall in its place. Panic began to take hold. I ran from room to room, searching for an exit, calling for Ellen. But the house seemed to shift around me, corridors stretching endlessly, doors leading to impossible places. And in every shadow, in every dark corner, I could feel her presence. The shadow fairy. Watching, waiting. Finally, exhausted and desperate, I collapsed on the living room floor. That's when I noticed something in the center of the room, a tarnished silver-framed antique mirror. With trembling legs, I approached. What I saw reflected back made me scream in horror. My face was changed. My eyes, once a bright blue, were now black pits, identical to the creature's. My skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. And behind me, grinning with teeth too sharp to be human, was she, the shadow fairy. No longer a separate entity, but part of me. Forever. I don't know how much time has passed since that fateful night. Days, weeks, years. Everything blurs into the eternal darkness that is now my reality. The Holloway house has become my prison and my kingdom. Its walls shift and twist according to the will of the shadow fairy, my will, for now we are one. Sometimes when the moon is full and the barrier between worlds is thinner, I hear voices. Curious people, unsuspecting explorers, drawn by the rumors and legends surrounding this cursed place. A part of me, what remains of the old Jacob, wants to scream, to warn them to flee. But that voice grows fainter with each passing day. The darkness grows, hungry, and so I wait in the shadows, waiting for the next fool who dares to cross the threshold of this house, waiting to drag yet another soul into eternal darkness. Because now I know the truth that my former skeptical self vehemently denied. There are things in this world beyond human comprehension. There are ancient terrors lurking in the shadows, hungry and patient. Tiredness isn't a strong enough word to describe what I was feeling. Working as a nurse in a busy hospital means more than just physical exhaustion. It's witnessing the pain of others seeping into your skin, occupying spaces that once belonged solely to you. And over time, it erodes you, transforming you into something that barely remembers who you were before. So when Dr. Marshall suggested I take a few days off, I accepted, with a nearly desperate gratitude. The plan was simple. I needed silence, solitude, a break. No phone calls or night shifts. Just me, the cabin I found online, and the trees surrounding it, offering the promise of something resembling peace. The whispering woods sounded like the perfect place. Isolated, tranquil, A small wooden house in the middle of foliage so dense that the world outside seemed to vanish. It was exactly what I needed. Peace, silence, a place where I could finally breathe. But as soon as I arrived, I realized that the silence here was different. It wasn't welcoming or relaxing, it was suffocating. The trees, with their towering and thick canopies, barely allowed sunlight to touch the ground. The darkness seemed alive, something moving between the trunks, watching me from afar. As I walked toward the cabin, the only sounds I heard were my own footsteps and my breath, both uncomfortably loud in the still air. On the first night, I slept restlessly, surrounded by an invisible weight, as if the forest were slowly swallowing me whole. On the second night, the silence broke. It was nearly midnight when I first heard it, a soft music floating through the air with no clear origin. It seemed to come from all sides, reverberating among the ancient trees, like a melody made of wind and shadows. It made no sense, but there was something about it that called to me. It was mesmerizing, like a song you can't ignore. I woke up startled, eyes wide, breath hitching. This wasn't normal. There was no one for miles, and yet the music, it was there, wrapping around me, pulling me from the bed. I didn't want to go. My body protested, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up in a way I'd never felt before. But my bare feet found the cold floor, and before I knew it, I was at the cabin door, walking toward the forest. The ground was damp and cold beneath my feet, but it didn't matter. All I could think about was the melody, its magnetism pulling me deeper into the darkness. The trees around me seemed alive, leaning over me, hiding the sky. The feeling of being watched, which had been subtle before, was now palpable. Something was watching me, something very old and very dangerous. Then, in the heart of the forest, the music suddenly stopped. The clearing appeared before me, as if the forest had opened a path just for me. The trees receded, creating a space where the moonlight, by some miracle, finally managed to break through. But what caught my attention most were the tiny points of light dancing in the air. Fireflies, I thought at first, trying to rationalize the impossible. But as I drew closer, I realized that those lights were not insects. They were something more. They were fairies, small creatures the size of a hand, with glowing wings and translucent bodies shimmering in the air. They floated in circles, the music I had heard before now resonating within me, almost like an echo. The fairies twirled and laughed, their smiles wide and eyes filled with a brilliance that, somehow, made me take a step back. For a brief moment, they were beautiful. Creatures of ancient magic, like the childhood legends I could barely remember believing in. But as I approached, their faces began to change. The innocent smile twisted into a sinister curve, and their eyes, they turned black, hollow, soulless. My heart raced. Something was deeply wrong. Their glowing wings now seemed sharp, almost like blades. When they realized I was watching them, one of their smiles widened in an unnatural way, as if its lips could tear its face. Then the music stopped completely. The moment the sound ceased, they lunged at me. Small but fast, they swarmed in, laughing as their tiny claws tore into my skin. The pain was instant, deep, but what terrified me most were the whispers. Ancient words, incomprehensible, yet heavy with a visceral malice. I tried to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground, as if the forest was conspiring against me. One of them, with wings as sharp as knives, sank into my shoulder, while others hung in my hair, pulling it tightly. Their touch was not merely physical. With every strike, I felt something deeper being lost. A piece of my mind, of my soul, being ripped away. The emptiness grew within me. "Let me go!" I screamed, desperate, but the whispers only intensified. The darkness of the forest surrounded me, and the fairies, now completely monstrous, seemed to feed on my panic. When I fell to my knees, my strength draining away, I felt one of them whisper in my ear, and the chill of its words took root in my mind. They were breaking me, not just physically, but tearing away what made me human. They wanted more than my body. They wanted my soul. And then, amidst that storm of pain and despair, something changed. The fairies stopped all at once as if waiting for something. That's when I saw it, another me. A smaller version of myself, floating among them. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't an illusion. It was me, but somehow, distorted. She had my eyes, but they were empty, lifeless. The diminutive version of me was taken by the fairies into the darkness of the trees. They didn't just want to kill me, They wanted to imprison me. They were taking something from me that I would never be able to reclaim. And then, just like that, they vanished. The fairies disappeared into the forest, taking my soul with them. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same. I was no longer the same. When I finally stood up, staggering back to the cabin, I felt something wrong. It was as if I were walking in a body that didn't belong to me. My emotions, my thoughts, everything felt distant, muted. The fear that should have been pulsing within me was merely a faint echo. I was alive, but I was a corpse inside. Looking at my reflection in the cabin mirror, I saw the shadow of who I once was. My eyes, which had once held life, were now empty, like those of the fairies that attacked me. I had lost something, something that would never return. Now I am a prisoner of the whispering forest, an empty soul, living as a shadow of myself. There is no escape, no way out. I am condemned to wander among these trees, hollow, with nothing to cling to. And the worst part? The music still echoes at night, calling other unsuspecting souls to lose themselves in the darkness. Working in a fine dining restaurant demands as much from the soul as it does from the body. I knew this well. Every knife cut, every plated dish, every order shouted through the kitchen window. It was a cycle that consumed more of me each day. There was no room left for anything else. My name is Leonardo, and as much as people saw me as a successful chef, in reality, I felt like a walking zombie. I was 32 years old and had never taken a real vacation. I was always involved in events, dinners, culinary shows. My body begged for rest, but my mind longed for something I couldn't quite identify. Then came the invitation. Aurea was a regular customer at the restaurant, but she had something peculiar about her. It wasn't just the way she spoke, soft and sibilant, or her beauty, which seemed otherworldly. No, there was something more. When she invited me to cook an exclusive dinner at her mansion in the fog-covered hills, I accepted without much thought. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was that urgent need for change, for something different, to tear through the routine. Somehow I thought it would just be another interesting experience. Upon arriving, however, I immediately realized I had made a mistake. Aurea's mansion was a relic of another time, a vast and ancient structure with stone walls that seemed to suffocate the surrounding environment. The air was dense, saturated with a mist that felt as though it was not just covering the hill, but penetrating my bones. The wind whistled through the dark trees surrounding the property, and each step I took echoed in the oppressive silence. As I approached, Aurea appeared at the door, her enchanting smile glimmering in the faint twilight light. At first, her presence seemed to bring a sense of lightness. But looking back now, I think that feeling was a trap. Something in the way her eyes sparkled that night already carried a foreboding of what was to come. Inside the mansion, everything was grand, but tinged with desolation. Golden chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, and tattered tapestries spoke of a long-gone glory. The dining hall was vast, yet devoid of life, except for the few guests already seated at the immense table, like puppets waiting for their cue. There was a strangeness in their postures, an unsettling stillness, but at first, I brushed it aside. I had a job to do. Cooking was my only anchor. I prepared a banquet based on what Aurea had requested, refined dishes that would transcend the ordinary. The mansion's kitchen was almost a sanctuary, fully equipped, although it seemed to have gone unused for years. Each dish I prepared, each ingredient I touched, seemed to take on a life of its own. There was something in the atmosphere of that house that made every detail, every aroma, feel more intense, more alive. As the night wore on, between stirring sauces, I could feel the weight of the guests' eyes on me, as if they were hungry for something more than just food. When I finally served the dinner, I observed the guests closely. None of them seemed real. Their conversations were strange, nonsensical, exchanges that sounded empty, as if they were being forced. And Aurea, always at the center like a queen surveying her domain, seemed to savor not just the food but the moment. She smiled, a smile that now makes me think of a snake ready to strike. After dinner, Aurea invited me to stay. She suggested I explore the ballroom a little. It was a strange invitation, as most events of this kind end with a quick farewell and formal thanks. But something inside me, perhaps curiosity, perhaps exhaustion, compelled me to accept. The ballroom was an extension of endless corridors, with paintings that seemed to follow me with their gaze. The music floated in the air, almost inaudible, an ancient melody, full of sorrow. I walked slowly, feeling a growing pressure on my chest, as if the very air were pushing me back. That was when I saw something that paralyzed me. The guests, who had once seemed pale, had now transformed. Their bodies were twisted, their skin had taken on a grayish hue, and their eyes were pits of darkness, empty and soulless. I felt an indescribable chill creep up my spine. They were not human. And then, Aurea appeared beside me, her once dazzling smile now a sinister caricature of itself. "Did you enjoy the evening?" her voice echoed in the empty hall, and in that moment, I understood the true purpose of the invitation. Aurea revealed herself. She was not merely a woman. She was not even human. She was the queen of the fairies, a creature from a realm far older than I could imagine. And the banquet I had prepared, well, that was just the beginning. Each dish was an offering, a part of a ritual intended to trap me. "Did you think you were in control, Leonardo?" Her voice was cold, and as she spoke, the guests drew closer, their skeletal fingers reaching out toward me. "You are the true dish of the night. Your soul will be devoured, just like theirs were." My body began to freeze. I felt my energy being drained, my vitality slowly stripped away, as if I were being emptied from the inside out. Terror surged within me, but it was more than that. It was a sense of loss, of despair, as if I were being torn from myself. My hands trembled, my heart raced, and as I looked at Aurea, I saw the truth. I was doomed. In one last desperate effort, I remembered a knife I had left in the kitchen. I needed to break the spell. With a run that felt like it lasted an eternity, I returned to the kitchen, my legs weighing a ton. I grabbed the knife, and at the moment Aurea approached, her guests behind her, I slashed the air, cutting through the void. A shrill scream filled the room, and for a second, the illusion shattered. I ran out of the mansion, stumbling through the fog, feeling the shadows around me, trying to drag me back. When I finally reached the road, I looked back and saw the mansion disappear, as if it had never existed. I escaped, but I will never be the same. My memories of that night are distorted, a blend of fear and regret. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the faces of those guests, their hands outstretched, waiting for something that will never come. The food I prepared was not for them, it was for me. Now, all that remains is the bitter memory of that banquet. A dinner that began with the promise of something grand, but ended with a lost soul in the shadows. I am Leonardo, and cooking will never be the same for me. There is something about Ireland that has always called to me. Perhaps it was the ancestry rooted in the Celtic myths that had fascinated me since adolescence. Or perhaps it was the feeling that there, in that fog-covered land, time flowed differently. As if there were something beyond the veil of reality, something hidden, waiting to be unveiled. That's how I found myself embarking on an expedition into the depths of an ancient forest that was said to hold secrets unseen for millennia. The forest was vast, filled with trees so ancient that their trunks twisted as if their roots bore the weight of countless ages. The air was dense and cold, and there was a constant mist that enveloped everything, creating the sensation that the place was alive, watching. The moss, damp and thick, seemed to emit an eerie glow in the dark, like a natural beacon illuminating my path. My feet sank slightly into the soaked ground as I made my way through the labyrinth of trees, guided only by instinct and the old map I had found in a forgotten archive. Each step echoed in the depths of the forest, a constant reminder that I was far from the ordinary world. I could feel it. I was no longer just walking through a grove. I was entering a different realm, a space between reality and something much older, much more dangerous. It was then that I found the sanctuary. A circle of ancient stones, worn by time, surrounded a small chamber in the heart of the forest. The place emanated a dark, heavy energy that made me hesitate for a moment. There was something wrong there, something that told me to turn back and run, but I was blinded by curiosity. That damned curiosity. As I entered the sanctuary, the silence intensified. The wind, which had once rustled the treetops, seemed to have been swallowed by the very place. And then I saw it. In the center of the chamber, a brilliant crystal, larger than anything I had ever seen, pulsed with a light that seemed to breathe. Its faceted surfaces reflected shadows moving along the walls, even though I was alone. I should have left. I should have turned my back on it all. But instead, I took a step forward, drawn in by the beauty of that object. My fingers touched the crystal. The sensation was immediate. A jolt coursed through my body, as if every cell were being invaded by a surge of energy. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and before I could process what was happening, the world around me shattered into fragments of light and shadow. When the tremor ceased, I realized I was no longer in the chamber. The sky above me glowed with a supernatural light, a deep purple, as if the stars were closer, almost within reach. All around me, colors too vibrant to be natural filled the landscape, which was both beautiful and terrifying. The air was heavy, dense, almost palpable, carrying with it the metallic scent of impending danger. It was then that I saw them. The fairies. But they were not the delicate creatures I had read about in childhood tales. They were tall, ethereal, with wings made of glass that shimmered in the supernatural light. Their eyes did not reflect kindness, but rather a deep darkness, as if they looked through me, into something beyond my comprehension. Their voices, sweet and insidious, echoed in the air, promising secrets and knowledge I would never have accessed in my world. They surrounded me, smiling with a dangerous beauty, their slender hands floating through the air as if inviting me to follow them. Yet, with each step I took, it felt as though I was drifting further away from who I was. Something within me was changing, something I couldn't explain. It was as if my very being was being slowly emptied, left behind in this distorted realm. "You have been chosen," one of them whispered, her voice like the wind sweeping through a field of bones. "You are the liberator." Those words echoed in my mind. Liberator? Liberate what? With each step, my body grew heavier, as if the very energy of the crystal was draining me. I was losing track of time, and what once felt like a simple walk transformed into an endless march through a field of distorted colors and sinister shadows. Then one of them, the one who seemed to lead the group, approached me. Her smile was sharp as broken glass, and her gaze pierced my soul. "We are trapped here," she whispered. "For millennia, we have awaited the chosen one." That was when the truth was revealed. They were trapped in that ethereal realm, banished by something far more powerful than I could ever imagine. And I, in my foolishness, had touched the crystal, activating an ancient spell that would free them. But at a price. They wanted my body, my soul, as a vessel to walk once more in the human world. I tried to resist. I tried to pull away, but the ground around me began to crack, and I realized the energy of the crystal was slowly consuming me. My body was no longer my own. It was in that moment of greatest despair that the truth struck me. The sanctuary I had found was not merely a sacred place. It was a prison, created by ancient gods to contain those fairies, cruel creatures that had devastated the world ages ago. They had been banished to that realm for their own wickedness. And I, naive, had fallen into their trap, but it was too late. The energy of the crystal intensified and my body began to crystallize, layer by layer. My thoughts became muddled, my vision fragmented, and the last thing I saw before turning into a statue was the wicked smile of the lead fairy. They were free, and I was trapped. A crystal statue in the center of the chamber, destined to guard the secret of that place forever. The forest would never be the same. With the fairies free, chaos would spread across the world, and the sinister glow of the moss on the trees would be just the first sign that something ancient and terrible had awakened. What remains of me, trapped in the crystal, is merely a shadow of who I once was. With each passing day, I feel the fairies walking among the living, spreading the darkness that I, unwittingly, unleashed. And in the heart of the forest, the sanctuary continues to shine, waiting for the next fool daring enough to touch the crystal. Moving to a small town seemed like the perfect decision at the time. I was 19, full of dreams, and ready to embark on a new chapter with my best friend Anna. Our choice of home wasn't the most practical, but something about it drew us in from the moment we laid eyes on the old structure. It was a colonial building, with tall windows, a sloped roof, and a garden that, despite being overgrown, still held traces of its former glory. It felt as if the place held stories waiting to be unearthed, and that captivated us. In the first few days, we explored every corner of the house, excited by the possibility of transforming the space into something our own. The walls creaked at night, but we laughed it off, saying it was just the old wood settling. Until then, everything was perfect, almost idyllic. The kind of tranquility that makes you believe you made the right choice. It was in the garden that things began to change. Revitalizing the garden seemed like an exciting project. It was covered in dry leaves, and the tall weeds had swallowed what was once a lush display of flowers. For weeks, Anna and I spent our afternoons trimming branches, pulling weeds, and clearing the debris that time had accumulated. There was a strange calmness in it, almost therapeutic, until the day we found the book. We were working near an ancient tree, its twisted and thick roots jutting out of the ground like hands hardened by time. As we removed a thick layer of leaves, Anna suddenly stopped and called me over. There, wedged among the roots, was a dark, rectangular object, covered in dust. A book. As I picked it up, I felt the old dry leather of the cover, almost disintegrating at my touch. There was no title, only symbols etched into the aged skin. When we opened it, we found pages filled with a twisted, uneven handwriting. As we flipped through, we realized this wasn't just an ordinary diary. It was a dark record, detailing rituals and mentioning mystical creatures that apparently inhabited that very garden. And then came the most disturbing entry. Fairies. One page read in darker, chaotic letters, live in this soil. They offer immortality to those who provide them with an adequate sacrifice. I laughed when I read that aloud, but the laughter died in my throat when I looked at Anna. She wasn't smiling. There was something in her eyes, a glint I couldn't identify. Something between fascination and fear. It was shortly after we found the book that things started to go wrong. At first, they were just small sensations. The impression that something was watching us from the other side of the garden, whispers in the wind, distant laughter that belonged to no one. We tried to rationalize it, thinking our minds were playing tricks on us. But gradually, the visions began. One afternoon, while we were pulling weeds, I looked up and saw two children standing in the distance, near the tree where we had found the book. Their faces were strangely still, devoid of expression. They didn't move, they just watched, their smiles too wide, their eyes empty. I turned to call Anna, but when I looked back, the children had vanished, dissolved into the mist that began to form as evening fell. That night, as we tried to sleep, the sound of laughter echoed through the room, even though we knew there was no one else in the house besides us. The flowers in the garden, which had previously seemed wilted and neglected, began to bloom in a startling manner. Bright red flowers, as if they were stained with blood. Anna appeared to be affected differently. She didn't mention the children or the flowers, but I often caught her staring at the book. Sometimes she would whisper something to herself, her gaze distant. I began to fear that the diary was slowly poisoning our minds. That night, when the crying began, I thought I was imagining things. It was late, and Anna and I were watering the garden, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the strange occurrences. The sound seemed to come from the depths of the garden, almost imperceptible at first, but soon became clear. A child's cry, low and constant, as if something or someone was suffering. Anna and I exchanged glances. There was fear in her eyes, the same fear I felt. We decided to investigate. We walked toward the source of the sound, with the moon as our only light, its weak rays barely piercing the darkness that enveloped the garden. In the middle of the tall weeds, we found something that shouldn't have been there. A doll. Not an ordinary doll, but an old figure. Its dress faded and dirtied, its eyes stitched with thick threads, and a sinister smile plastered on its face. There was something wicked about that doll. The crying ceased the moment Anna picked it up, and I could swear the doll's smile seemed to widen, as if it were satisfied. After that night, we knew we couldn't stay there any longer. The visions worsened. The children appeared more frequently, their faces deformed and distorted, like reflections in a broken mirror. The flowers in the garden continued to grow, but now their stems dripped a dark liquid, resembling blood. And the doll? Anna kept it near our bed, claiming it was an offering for the fairies. That's when we decided to take action. We could no longer endure it, the fear and the constant sensation that something was watching us, waiting. In one last act of desperation, we resolved to burn the book and the doll. That night, we took both to the center of the garden and set them on fire. The flames rose, crackling in the thick air of the early morning. As the fire consumed the aged leather of the diary and the doll melted slowly, I felt as if something was being released. I don't know if our minds finally broke, but for a brief moment, I thought I heard a sharp scream coming from deep within the earth, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the depths of the soil. We never returned to the garden. We left that house soon after the burning. We moved to another town, vowing never to speak of what happened. But even years later, the memories linger. Sometimes I still dream of the smiling children, the sound of crying echoing in the distance. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I feel that something or someone is still watching me, waiting. Perhaps the fairies got their sacrifice after all.